Hello, and welcome to this youth panel event. My name's James. I'm an ambassador with MQ, and I'm joined here by Jamie, Cassie, Asha, and Meghna. And I'm so looking forward to this event this afternoon. I think many people have been looking forward to it. For me, mostly to sort of pass as a young person still. But more seriously, we've had such amazing content and talks already this afternoon about the importance of young people's mental health. And of course, the importance of mental health in general has been highlighted by the coronavirus pandemic too. And we know that 75% of people living with mental illness started developing symptoms in their youth before the age of 18. And I think about my own experiences, and I didn't get a formulation or treatment that worked for me until I was 31. And we know that that is not good enough. But we also know that we could tell a much more positive story about youth mental health, that people can get the right support when they need it, and that perhaps even mental health problems for many could be prevented. So I think that mental health science has to be better than just illustrating the increase in demand for services, especially with the pandemic, and be better than just documenting the decline in the delivery of treatment that helps people. We need to really move towards thinking about what works for who, and to start to implement that change, and then collect that data, and then feed it all into a virtuous cycle for young people's mental health, rather than a vicious cycle, or the story that we too commonly hear still today. But mental health science isn't separate from the young people who it researches, and research should be done with, not to people. And so central to this is the voices of young people themselves. And I think it's so important to remember, we've talked yesterday about co-production as well, that there are many different ways of knowing. And one of them, perhaps the most important one of them, is through experience. So it's all of our job to try and reflect in research lived experience of mental health from a diverse range of people. So today we have a broad and informal chat to hear directly from young people themselves. I'm hoping to step aside a little bit to let them have the floor. And it's important to say that it's not a curated kind of talk where we've really rehearsed and polished and refined our experiences. And I know that many people sometimes feel that lived experience can only be involved on certain terms and in a very curated kind of way. But actually, giving that floor to the young people themselves, I think, is really, really important. So basically, to everybody here on the panel, permission to butt in whenever you like, and permission to not answer any questions too, and don't feel pressured to say anything at all. So I've had some really interesting discussions with people who are attending this summit about what they want to hear. And we're going to start with a really broad question that I'm going to put to you, Asha, because you're the only person here I've met face to face for real. And when we're thinking about researching mental health in young people, why do you think that it's especially important to research mental health in young people, and perhaps especially because of the coronavirus pandemic?
I think one of the most important things that I've noticed, especially with this summit, is actually giving young people a voice and being part of the research as well. Growing up, we never even spoke about mental health. I'm like you, I'm shocked I'm on the youth panel at my age, to be honest with you. So growing up and just seeing the experiences, I remember suffering with anxiety, depression, self-harming and suicidal tendencies, and not being able to talk about that openly until I was in my mid-20s. So the fact that we're doing research and we're actually touching upon young people and their experiences and actually listening to them, I think that's the most vital thing in the whole summit side of it and the whole research side of it.
Yeah, and I know we've talked before about our experiences with mental health and things, and I'm wondering, why might research have helped you? Or if there was more research, then how might your story have been different?
For me, a lot of it's based on me facing honour-based violence when I was younger. I think the correct research would have helped in regards to treatment-wise. I've been to professionals who've not understood the cultural side to why I'm suffering, what I'm suffering. A lot of it had been brushed over even by professionals when I finally managed to go and get support. But with the right kind of research, we might get professionals actually realising how much different aspects of like, for instance, let's talk about honour-based violence. It affects different victims differently. Some might feel socially isolated at one point. Some might start feeling anxious, depressed, suicidal, etc. Without that research, how are we meant to implement literally anything and find the right sort of mental health treatment for them and what's tailored to them?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, isn't it? And the pandemic has really highlighted inequalities and cultural differences. We know that not all people are affected by things in the same kinds of ways. And maybe the challenge for researchers is, when you're involving young people, are you involving a diverse range of young people to make really meaningful research that speaks to people who need the support the most? Because it's not enough just to tick that box and say we had a young person or they looked pretty young, which I think is what happens for me, thankfully. But I wondered, Meghna, whether you'd had any sort of thoughts yourself about the importance of diversity and research that reflects different communities.
Yeah, I think the most important thing about any research is that it's supposed to serve a purpose, right? Mental health research is supposed to help people, just in a very layman basic form. If it's not able to actually reach the people, or if it's not able to be relatable to the people it's working for, what is it really doing? Often the case with young people is that they're viewed as patients. They're viewed as lesser than. There is a very clear power dynamic in research where the therapist is somebody who is the helper and somebody is the helped, instead of it being an equal ground. Similarly, people don't express even depression and anxiety in the same ways. There are so many different cultural differences across how depression is expressed. Many communities still don't talk about it. It's still just something in your head, doesn't matter, leave it, stay with your family, it's going to be fine. And I mean, I say that obviously that is a very Indian experience for me. So I think once you involve people from a lot of different backgrounds, you understand the culture and the context that they're coming from, and you can see the things that might have worked for them in that cultural context. There's no point giving them a solution that doesn't apply to the context they're living in. If it doesn't apply to their environment, it's not going to do much for them. So I think it's actually going to help us form solutions that will work for the people based on where they are at any point in life, geographically, in terms of religion, in terms of anything. Honestly, I think that diversity is really important.
I think you articulated that so fantastically, and I know that people who work clinically really want to have research done that they can refer to really help people in the context of their own lives, and that's what it comes down to, doesn't it? It's not about proving a model or trying to prove a theory, it's about how can we really help people. And I think that that has to start with listening to people, and it really helps if they can articulate themselves so beautifully as you did. Cassie, I wondered if you wanted to come in on that one, because I saw you were typing in the chat, but that might have been me multitasking.
Sure. I think the main point I want to add is that diversity is more than culture. I think when we think about diversity in EDI, we think about it in terms of race and LGBT and disability, and I've forgotten the other one. But I think the point is that diversity is so much more than that. Like, diversity can be things like being a carer or taking care of an elderly parent, for example, or growing up in an abusive environment makes you a diverse individual, even if it's not how we traditionally conceptualize diversity. So I think when you're trying to diversify mental health research and you're trying to diversify how young people fit into that, it has to be more than just the token young person, but it has to be more than just, oh, it's that token young person that also has a disability, or oh, it's that token young person that's also non-binary, because it's so much more than that in diversity. But
yes, absolutely. And I think these things really intersect sometimes, don't they? And the trouble with thinking about diversity and including people is that sometimes it becomes very reductive, doesn't it? And it's like, okay, I went on a course where I learned about very stereotypical views of what different groups are like and what their lives might be like, and that becomes the reference point rather than the person that's right in front of you, who might be in a clinical setting or trying to help with research. And I think that I had that in my own experiences, because I'm a gay man and I didn't really have any problems with that growing up, but I think that was used to explain away a lot of my difficulties rather than actually seeing me for who I am. And it was great that they recognized it and thought that it was relevant, but perhaps not in the ways that they assumed. And I think that that's really important to think about. So just moving on a little bit from that subject, I was thinking that if there are specific things that we need to research about young people's mental health at the moment and things that we want to understand. And I was wondering, Jamie, if you had any thoughts about the particular things, because I think we agree researching young people's mental health is really important. And what kinds of things might that be, especially maybe thinking about at the moment?
So I think, especially obviously in the wake of COVID, how we need to see how people have adapted on their own, how people have dealt with their own mental health issues. It's tricky because there's so many things I want to say that need looking at, and things that we need to concentrate on. I don't think there's anything I can pick out specifically that can,
Yeah, I think that it's a massive program of research that's probably needed, isn't it? I was wondering if, for you, like, has there been anything that stood out during the pandemic around coping with mental health that maybe has helped you?
I think there's been loads of different strategies that young people have used, such as things that maybe they haven't traditionally thought of as helping with their own mental health, like mindfulness, getting out and exercising, and just simple things like having daily social contact with other people, and people noticing that that does help with their mental health. And I think it can sort of help bridge the gap between theory and practice, in that it depends on your context so badly that we can't sort of research as a broad whole. We need to bring lived experience people in, and I think that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting to me, because it's like saying, well, what have young people turned to, and how do you find that out really as a researcher? Well, you start probably by asking young people rather than making your own hypotheses. Do you have any things, Asha, that you think should be specifically honed in on relating to how young people have coped with the pandemic?
I'm quite curious in regards to the social interaction and how much that's affected them, to be honest. I think that'd be quite an interesting point, because I know as adults it's affected me quite a lot and triggered my PTSD and all sorts. So that's one thing I'm quite curious on, how much it's affected them growing up, because you kind of rely on that interaction, don't you, as a way of growing up and experiencing different things. So I'm quite curious to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we'll leave that on for a moment, because your final question at the end of this panel, which is your warning, is if you had one thing for mental health science to focus on, what would it be? So I'm just dropping that in here so that you can have a panic. I'm joking, but it's a really hard question to answer, isn't it? But I wanted to get into this idea about involvement, because I think that's where the really juicy sort of conversation might be. And you know, we've said a little bit about why young people should be involved in actually doing the research themselves, but what does that actually look like in the ideal kind of scenario? I was wondering if I could throw that over to you, Cassie.
Sure. I think the number one thing about involvement for me, especially in mental health research, is the need to be transparent, because whether we like it or not, when you involve young people in mental health research, it's academics or the researchers which gain the most out of it, because they gain papers and ref scores and a reputation, and it's young people who are putting in this work. And I think transparency really is the key, that young people understand that that's the case, and what they put in won't be the same as what they get out, and that's not inherently a bad thing. So for me, I think involvement really looks like being honest with young people about where this project's going to go, how they can be involved, whether it's just being on an advisory group or whether they could get involved looking at analysis or looking at data, things like that. So I think the best involvement is there where young people can be involved at whatever steps, however much they like. But I appreciate ethically that's quite a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, but I'm hearing loud and clear that it's important that you know the scope of that, or the parameters of that, and exactly what that involvement looks like, maybe from the outset, so you kind of know what you're signing up to? Because I think this is just what I've experienced, is that sometimes you're kind of sold that you're going to be involved in all these wonderful ways and like it's going to be so good for you and everything, and then it turns out actually you only have a limited say over one little bit. And is that meaningful is one question, but I guess what you're saying is, well, is that what I signed up for, and is that transparent?
Yeah, I don't think it's meaningful isn't really part of it as much as just, do you understand the extent to which you will be able to contribute? And I think that's why it comes down to co-production, where we propose for funding and propose ideas that need researching. That's when you ask young people, how would you like to be involved in this research? Where would you like to be involved in this research? Would you like us to help? Would you like to help us write papers? Would you like to disseminate this data? Like, there's so many steps to research, but so much of being involved as a young person is being an advisor and looking at a topic guide or something along those lines, which is interesting, but also might not be, if for someone that's already involved in research, they clearly are there because they're invested in the topic and because they want to contribute. And young people are so willing to give and academics are so hesitant to take, and that's why it needs to be this transparent conversation from the get-go.
Yeah. And Meghna, I saw you were nodding along to that, and I wondered what you think that young people, I guess young people might bring a lot of different things and want to be involved at different stages in different kinds of ways. But what do you think would be missed out if young people weren't involved in the research process, perhaps at any stage? Like, what do young people really bring?
Wow, you flipped the switch. All right, the script, right? So I think what would be missed out is basically the very reasons we're looking to involve young people in research. It's to have that, get the idea about what young people really want, what they're struggling with, what works, what doesn't work. Often, we look at technology, for example, in a very negative way. Classically, we look at it as like addictive, or it might be harmful. And of course, it can be all of those things. But for young people who have technology as such a big part of their lives, it might also be really helpful. Do we ask them how much your online friends are helping you? Do we ask them about like communities? So I think just those opinions, those nuances of like a generation that's living a very different life from, say, perhaps another generation that's currently able to conduct the researches, I think you miss out on that entire perspective and you lose out on a lot of potential, honestly.
Yeah, and I think for me that relates to what Jamie was saying. It's sort of like, well, what are young people doing that actually might help? And we often only focus on the negative side of things, and we don't ask that question of, well, what keeps people well, or what helps people to be well? And I'm wondering, maybe loads of young people are doing a lot of really helpful things, but how do we capture that as, you know, data scientists or mental health scientists and things? And, you know, we can't present that as data, but it is maybe happening. And perhaps we need more flexible or different systems to evidence what works for people, and turn that sort of anecdote into evidence. I think that's a really interesting point. I was going to ask you, Jamie, around this involvement question, about what helps you to be involved. So we've had the transparency, we've had sort of being listened to as a theme, but what helps you maybe practically or in general to be involved in developing and doing research?
I think communication's a massive thing. Transparency is a big thing. I don't think there's a set rules. We're still learning how to involve lived experience people in research. I don't think there'll be many instances, or I haven't seen many instances where we've gone into a meeting with researchers where we know exactly what we're going to help with, exactly what we're going to do. I think initially it's a big part of it. It's just a communication process, lots of dialogue. And to be honest, when I first started in research, using my lived experience, I had absolutely no idea how I would be able to help. I thought that who hasn't studied it, haven't spent time studying these things, I don't know research methods that well. But then we get into the meeting and I've rarely been in a meeting where they've finished on time because we just have so much to talk about. And I don't think I've also ever heard the words, oh, I hadn't thought of that as much before I'd started working with researchers. So it is a really surprising process how much we can help. And yeah, it is a learning process. We're still trying to figure out how we can best implement lived experience.
Yeah, and that's kind of this whole idea of, well, what is expertise? Because the people you're in the room with are experts in their field, aren't they? And then they're the ones who are saying, oh, I never thought about that. Never thought about that. And it's sort of like, well, that shows that there is a real source of knowledge from people with their lived experience that has to be listened to. And like you said, that open communication, do you think that's something, firing it back at you, do you think there's something there about sort of deciding, like, even before the project is designed, like what the lived experience is going to be? Because I think sometimes I've gone into projects and it's already been decided, and I think it would have been nice to have that conversation with me as the person with the experience before even like setting up the terms of the project, because then all the budget's decided, everything is decided, and it's really hard to change it. What do you think about that, Jamie, about the communication?
Yeah, I mean, it is an obstacle. I think, as we were talking about earlier, there's so much variation and in lived experience, and researchers I don't think know what to expect when we come into a meeting or something, and neither do lived experience advisors. But I think just from practicing this and from consistently going over in this kind of way, I think that's the only way we can sort of beat that obstacle.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think it's worked for me in situations where we've been able to stop and reevaluate and be like, is this working? And we need to have that communication all the time. So there's a question in from the audience, which I have an answer to, but I wondered what your answers were, and it's quite an easy one. It's kind of yes or no. Asha, how do you feel about young people being authors on journal articles?
Can you skip it with me, only because I'm not the young person, so I'd much rather they answer that than me.
Yeah.
Is that all right?
Sure.
Sorry.
I'll go to you, Meghna. What do you think about young people being authors on journal articles?
I think it sounds great. I think, I mean, yeah, I am a young person, but I'm not just a young person. I can also be a researcher. I'm also a psychologist. I'm also a lot of different things. And my expertise, my lived experience will add to my expertise. It is not the only factor that is there to be looked at. So I feel it's important.
Brilliant. Yeah, and Cassie, what do you think?
I feel like publishing as a whole field is sort of falling behind in the conversation about experts by experience, where we are being involved in research to whatever extent itself, but we haven't quite got to the publishing or the peer reviewing part yet. And I definitely think it's the next step.
Yeah, I think it needs to be developed, and maybe we can put together some kind of commission for that and be advised. And Jamie, what do you think about that?
I think it's a great idea. I think a big barrier to using lived experience is that sort of we as young people see research as this all exclusive.
Well, I think you've been muted.
Sorry.
You're back.
So, I think young people often see research and universities as a sort of exclusive club that we can't access or help with. And I think it is a big question of empowerment and encouragement by saying that we are going to help you produce this said article or something. And it will really encourage more lived experience people to get involved. And although I think maybe lived experience people coming into research and helping with research might not have the expertise to really get into the nitty-gritty stuff, but if they're there in the first place, they're so eager to learn about these different things, learn how research occurs, learn about publishing, about writing articles. And in that sense, I think it's very much a mutual flow of learning. So I think there's so much opportunity for researchers to learn about lived experience and what we can bring. And in turn, I think by including lived experience, these young people can learn so much, and you can sort of see it as an investment in the future.
Yeah, that's a fantastic summary, I think. And I personally think that young people should be authors on papers of studies that they've produced, and that the studies wouldn't be the same if they weren't involved, or they shouldn't be the same if they weren't involved. And like Meghna said, I would really reiterate that point, that we are more than just the lived experience. And I often find having lived experience of mental health problems just gives me a license to get in the room to say things that come from other skills and come from other experiences and other assets that we can offer to researchers, well beyond just being diagnosed with a mental health problem, perhaps. So we're on to our last questions, and it will have to be brief. If there's one thing for mental health science to focus on, what would it be? And I'm going to start with saying it has to be about the co-production. I'm going to steal that one for myself. So I think that mental health science has to focus on how diverse voices of those the research implicates can be involved in the doing of the work and working with young people, not just this transactional kind of relationship. I think that's going to be a really important next step that should be standardized and enhanced. So that's my program of research. Asha, what about you?
God, it's a hard question, that one as well. So I think we've got a long way to go. I think that's the main thing. I think throughout the whole research I think the most important thing is actually breaking down the barriers and getting people involved, because I think that sometimes can be the barrier to providing this.
Yeah.
We've got 2 minutes.
And Meghna, what do you think? It could be something you've said already, it could be an area that you've talked about already, or one thing for mental health science.
I think we have to give up on this idea that one solution is going to fit everyone. We can't have a goal that's like, oh, this thing is going to solve all the problems. No, it won't. We should work more in communities and smaller groups where we can see what works and see if it's sustainable, rather than creating a grand scheme to fix everything at once. It won't happen like that. Yeah.
Brilliant. And Jamie?
I just want to echo what's been said. I think I really want to see more lived experience and co-production involvement. I think it will help enormously in bridging the theory with the practice, help legitimizing research and with policy compliance, and also really want to see a focus on how much variation there can be in mental health. I think everyone, even if you have a selection of people who all have anxiety or depression, they're all going through a completely different thing. Different treatments might help them. So I really want to have a focus on helping with different contexts and stuff like that.
Brilliant. And lastly, to Cassie, before we finish, your one thing.
I'd really like a focus on a step away from sort of symptomology and a step towards the social aspects of mental health. And especially for young people, there's so many influences around growing up and bullying and isolation and loneliness. And I really think as mental health science and mental health research grows, it needs to take these things into account, as well as sort of what we already know in terms of social determinants of health. Like, really a step towards the social understanding would be perfect.
Brilliant. So I think that's a great challenge for anybody who's watching, and I think it's a perfect point to end with those voices of some young people who represent diverse backgrounds but have some wonderful points to say, and I hope that we've had plenty of food for thought. So thank you very much for watching, thanks for the questions, and thank you mostly to our wonderful panel.